found myself driving down Highway 65, a desolate stretch of road cutting through the heart of the Midwest. The landscape was empty, a mix of flat fields and occasional patches of woods, all cloaked in darkness. The only light came from the glow of my truck's headlights and the faint outline of the moon, struggling to break through thick clouds. I was hauling a load of refrigerated goods, heading to a warehouse in Missouri. The job was routine, but something about that night felt off from the moment I left the last truck stop. Maybe it was the cold silence of the night, or the way the wind howled like it was alive. Either way, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Around midnight, I saw it. At first, it was just a shadow on the side of the road. I thought it might be an animal, a deer, or maybe a stray dog, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person, a woman. Waving her arms frantically, her face pale under the dim glow of my lights. Her clothes were torn, and she looked like she'd been through hell. I hesitated for a moment. Every trucker knows the risks of picking up strangers, but something about her desperation pulled me in. I slowed down and rolled down my window. "You okay?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Please help me," she said, her voice shaking. "There's something out here. It's chasing me." I glanced around, my eyes scanning the empty road and dark fields. There was nothing but shadows and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees. Still, her fear was real, and I couldn't just leave her there. "Get in," I said, unlocking the passenger door. She climbed in quickly, her hands trembling as she buckled her seatbelt. She looked over her shoulder, as if expecting something to leap out of the darkness at any moment. "What's your name?" I asked, trying to calm her down. "Laura," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I nodded and pressed the gas pedal, the truck rumbling back to life. "Where are you headed?" "Anywhere but here," she said, her eyes wide and fixed on the road ahead. For the next few miles, she didn't say much. She just sat there, clutching her seatbelt and breathing heavily. I tried to make small talk, but she wasn't in the mood. Instead, I focused on the road, the unease in my gut growing with each passing mile. Then, nowhere, she screamed, "Stop! Stop the truck!" I slammed brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. My heart was pounding as I looked over at her. "What? What is it?" She pointed ahead, her hand trembling. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed it. A figure standing in the middle of the road. It was tall, unnaturally so, with limbs that seemed too long and a face that was obscured by shadow. It didn't move, didn't flinch, even as my truck's headlights illuminated it. "Go around it!" Laura shouted, panic in her voice. I didn't need to be told twice. I swerved onto the shoulder, the truck bouncing as it left the pavement. As I passed the figure, I glanced out my window. That was a mistake. Its face. It wasn't a face at all, just a void, like staring into a bottomless pit. And yet, I felt it looking at me, felt its gaze pierce through me like icy needles. "Drive!" Laura screamed, snapping me out of my trance. I floored it, the truck roaring as it barreled down the road. In the rearview mirror, the figure stood there, watching us until it was swallowed by the darkness. "What the hell was that?" I asked, my voice trembling. "I don't know," Laura said, tears streaming down her face. "It's been following me since I broke down." I wanted to ask more, but I couldn't focus on anything except the road ahead. My instincts told me to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between us and that thing. For a while, it seemed like we were safe. The road stretched on, empty and silent, except for the hum of the truck's engine. But then, the CB radio crackled to life. At first, it was just static, but then a voice broke through. "Driver, you can't outrun it." My blood ran cold. "Who is this?" I asked, my hand tightening on the wheel. No response. Just more static, followed by faint laughter that sent shivers down my spine. "It's playing with us," Laura said, her voice barely audible. I didn't know what to do. I was miles away from the nearest town, and there was no one else on the road. My only option was to keep driving and hope for the best. But the best didn't come. The lights on my dashboard began to flicker, and the truck's engine started to sputter. No, 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 I muttered, slamming my fist against the wheel. The crawl before coming to a complete stop. I tried turning the key, but the engine wouldn't start. What's happening? Laura asked, her voice trembling. I don't know, I said, trying to stay calm. Then we heard it, a faint tapping sound coming from the back of the truck. Laura's eyes widened, and she shook her head. Don't go out there. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the cab, my breath visible in the cold night air. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate. I walked around to the back of the truck, my heart pounding in my chest. The doors were closed, but the tapping was louder now, as if whatever was making the noise was inside. Taking a deep breath, I unlocked the doors and swung them open. The trailer was empty. The tapping stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. Then, I heard Laura scream. I ran back to the cab, but she wasn't there. The passenger door was wide open, and the wind howled through the empty space. Laura? I called out, my voice echoing in the darkness. There was no response. Just then, the CB radio crackled again, and the same voice from before spoke. She's gone, driver, just like the others. I felt a chill run down my spine as I climbed back into the truck, locking the doors behind me. The engine roared to life on its own, and the headlights flickered back on. I didn't question it. I just drove. To this day, I don't know what happened on that road. I never saw Laura again, and I never heard of anyone else encountering that thing. But every time I pass through the Midwest, I think about that night and wonder if it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. One thing's for sure, I'll never stop on Highway 65 again. After that night, I tried to forget about what had happened on Highway 65. I told myself it was a nightmare brought on by exhaustion, a trick of the mind during those long, lonely hours on the road. But deep down, I knew better. There were too many things I couldn't explain, and no matter how much I wanted to move on, the memory of that figure and Laura's disappearance haunted me. For weeks, I avoided that route entirely, choosing longer detours just to stay away from that cursed stretch of road. I didn't tell anyone about it either. What was I supposed to say? I saw a faceless thing and picked up a girl who vanished into thin air. People would have thought I was crazy, or worse, that I was responsible for her disappearance. But the road has a way of pulling you back. It was late January when I found myself in a bind. A last-minute job came up, a high-paying one, and the quickest route cut straight through Highway 65. I hesitated, weighing my options, but the paycheck was too good to pass up. I told myself it would be fine, that lightning doesn't strike twice in the same place. I was wrong. The first part of the trip was uneventful. The snow from an earlier storm blanketed the fields, and the road was quiet except for the occasional passing vehicle. I tried to keep my mind busy, tuning into the CB radio and singing along to the songs playing on my phone. Then, as I neared the stretch of road where I'd picked up Laura, my radio went silent. Not static, silent. It wasn't just the radio. The hum of my truck's engine seemed muted, as if the entire world had been wrapped in a heavy blanket. Even the sound of my tires on the asphalt felt distant. My chest tightened as I gripped the wheel, my eyes darting to the side of the road. I didn't want to see anything, but my gut told me I wasn't alone. Sure enough, up ahead, I saw it again. The figure stood in the middle of the road, just as it had before, tall, motionless, and shrouded in shadow. This time, I didn't stop. I pressed down on the accelerator, my truck barreling forward. And just before I reached it, it vanished. I exhaled sharply, relief washing over me, but it was short-lived. The CB radio crackled to life, and that same eerie voice spoke. "Welcome back, driver." My stomach dropped. The voice continued, calm and almost mocking. "Did you think you could escape me? You belong to the road, just like the others." I slammed my hand against the radio, trying to turn it off, but the voice didn't stop. "Laura tried to warn you, but you didn't listen. Now you'll join her." "Shut up," I shouted, my voice cracking. "What do you want from me?" The voice laughed, a low, chilling sound that made my skin crawl. "I want you to remember." Before I could respond, My truck's headlights flickered, and the engine sputtered. The truck came to a halt, just like before, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. My breath fogged up the cab as I looked around, searching for any sign of movement. The snow-covered fields were eerily still, but I knew better than to trust the quiet. Then, I saw her. Laura. She was standing on the side of the road, her clothes the same as the night I picked her up. She raised a hand, beckoning me. "Help me," she mouthed, though her voice didn't carry. I hesitated, every instinct screaming at me to stay in the truck, but I couldn't ignore her plea. Grabbing my flashlight, I stepped out into the freezing night. "Laura!" I called out, my boots crunching against the snow. She didn't respond, just turned and walked into the field. I followed, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Where are you going?" I shouted, my breath coming in short, panicked bursts. She didn't answer. The further I went, the colder it got. The wind picked up, carrying whispers that I couldn't understand. Shadows danced around me, moving just out of reach of my light. Finally, I stopped. "Laura!" I yelled again, but this time, my voice echoed back at me, distorted and wrong. Then I heard it, a faint rhythmic tapping, just like the one I'd heard on the back of my truck. I turned around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The figure was there, standing in the field, its void-like face fixed on me. Behind it, more shapes emerged from the shadows. Dozens of them, their forms twisted and unnatural. I stumbled back, my heart racing as the whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand. The figures closed in, their movements slow but deliberate. This was it. I was done for. But then, Laura appeared again, standing between me and the figures. She turned to me, her eyes full of sorrow. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice clear despite the howling wind. Before I could respond, she reached out and touched my chest. A wave of warmth spread through me, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was back in my... The engine was running, and the road ahead was clear. I didn't stick around to question it. I floored the gas and didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. That was the last time I ever drove on Highway 65. I don't know what happened that night, or what those things were, but I do know one thing. The road isn't always just a road. Sometimes, it's something else. Something hungry. And if you're not careful, it'll take you too. It's been a few years now since that night, but the memories still haunt me. I left truck driving behind after that last trip. Something inside me knew that if I didn't step away from the wheel, I'd be swallowed by whatever lurked on those lonely roads. The incident on Highway 65 changed me in ways I can't explain. I still hear that voice sometimes, even now. The same eerie, mocking tone whispering in the back of my mind. The worst part is, I don't know if I ever truly left. After I stopped driving, I tried to return to a normal life. I found work doing odd jobs in a small town, living in a quiet little house where the only noises at night were the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting for the right moment to drag me back. Every time I drove down a dark road, I felt it, like a cold breath on the back of my neck. I even had a couple of nightmares where I was back in that truck, driving through the snow, knowing something was just behind me. One night, a few months after I'd left the road behind, I received a call. It was from a fellow trucker, Dave. "You're not gonna believe this," he said, his voice shaky. "You've heard about the disappearances on 65, right?" I didn't want to hear it, but I knew what he was talking about. Stories had started circulating. Truckers talking about a tall, faceless figure on that stretch of road, a voice that would speak through the CB, and the odd disappearances that followed. Every now and then, a trucker would vanish without a trace, their rig found empty and abandoned in the middle of nowhere. "It's happening again, man," Dave continued. "I picked up a girl last night, same thing as you described, torn clothes, like she'd been running. She was crying, saying something was chasing her. I didn't think much of it, but then I saw that figure, right in the middle of the road." My stomach dropped. "You didn't stop, did you?" I asked. "I did," Dave admitted. "I couldn't just leave her there." But then the truck stalled, just like yours did. And I heard the voice. That voice, it told me I'd join them, told me I'd never make it out. I felt a chill spread over me. I had to ask, even though I already knew the answer. Did she disappear? There was a long pause before Dave spoke again, his voice barely a whisper. I don't know. When I got out of the truck, she was gone, just like that. I didn't need him to say any more. I knew what had happened. I had lived it. That road's cursed, I said quietly, the words hanging in the air between us. It doesn't let go. Once it has you, it never really lets you go. The line went silent, and I knew Dave wasn't going to continue the conversation. He was scared, just like I had been that night. But something in me snapped. I had to go back. Not for closure or redemption. No, this was something far darker. I needed to know the truth. I had to find out what had happened to Laura and the others. And most of all, I needed to face whatever it was that had claimed that stretch of road. The next night, I grabbed my old truck keys, walked out the door, and got into my old rig. The engine roared to life, and I found myself heading toward Highway 65 once again. As I neared the familiar stretch of road, the unease I had been trying to ignore grew inside me. The radio was silent, just as it had been before, and the wind picked up in a strange, almost unnatural way. It felt like the world itself was holding its breath. I reached the exact spot where I had picked up Laura all those years ago. I stopped the truck, turned off the engine, and stepped out. The night air was bitterly cold, and I could hear my breath fogging in front of me. But there was no sound of animals, no chirping of crickets or rustle of leaves, just silence. I stood there for a long time, waiting, listening. Then a faint tap echoed from behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing, just empty road stretching into the darkness. The tapping came again, louder this time. It wasn't from behind, it was from within the truck. I rushed back, my heart pounding, but when I opened the door there was nothing inside, no one. But then the voice came. "Welcome back," it said, as if it had been waiting for me all along. I jumped into the cab, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life again, and I floored the gas pedal. But no matter how fast I drove, the road seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of me. That's when I saw it. The figure. It wasn't standing in the road this time, it was on the shoulder, its face still a dark, featureless void. But now, I saw others standing beside it. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of shadowy forms, all with that same dark, empty face. They weren't just watching me, they were waiting. I couldn't outrun them. I slammed the brakes, my truck skidding to a stop. The figures began to move closer, their limbs twisting and stretching unnaturally. They surrounded my truck, their cold, invisible gazes pressing against me. And then I heard Laura's voice. "Remember," she whispered, "you're one of us now. You can never leave." I tried to scream, but no sound came. The shadows were closing in, and the cold seeped into my bones. It was too late. The road had claimed me. The cold wrapped around me like an iron grip, my breath fogging up the windows as the shadows pressed in closer. I could feel their presence, like thousands of unseen eyes, all focused on me. The truck groaned under their weight, the very air growing thick with a dark, oppressive energy. In the distance, I heard the faint tapping again, like 1,000 fingers drumming on metal. It was no longer coming from outside the truck. It was inside my head, reverberating through my skull, as if the road itself was speaking to me. "You can't escape," the voice echoed once more, its tone dark and patient, almost familiar now. "You belong to us. You always have." I reached for the door handle, trying to get out, but my hand trembled uncontrollably. The cold was seeping into my veins, paralyzing me, making every movement slow and heavy. It felt like the truck, the road, the world itself was pressing in on me. Every inch of space felt filled with the weight of their eyes. The figure, that faceless shadow, stepped closer. I could hear its feet dragging against the asphalt, though it didn't make a sound. The others followed, silent, patient, like a procession of lost souls. They reached out toward me, their limbs stretching unnaturally, their fingers elongating, inching ever closer to the glass. I wanted to scream, I wanted to fight, but the words were trapped inside me, and the fear froze my heart in place. Laura's voice came again, softer this time. "You should have listened. Now we're all together. You're just another part of the road." I tried to look away, tried to shut my eyes, but the darkness was everywhere. It was in the truck, it was in my mind, wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. And then, there was nothing. The truck, the shadows, the road, everything vanished. For a moment, there was complete silence, an unsettling, all-encompassing void. The cold was gone, and I felt weightless, like I was drifting through nothingness. And then, I opened my eyes. I was back in the cab of my truck, but it wasn't the same truck. The lights were off, and the dashboard was cracked and covered in dust, as if it had been sitting for years. The road ahead was dark, but not empty. There were others, truck after truck, all lined up in a silent, endless row. The drivers sat inside their vehicles, their faces pale and frozen in place, their eyes wide open but unblinking. And then I realized I wasn't alone anymore. The figures were there, standing between the trucks, watching. Some of them were familiar, faces I had seen before, like Laura. They all had that same void where their eyes should have been. They were part of the road now, trapped in an endless loop of time, forever waiting. I reached for the door, but I couldn't move. My hands were frozen, and my legs were stiff, like the truck had become a part of me. The shadows closed in, wrapping around me like a cocoon, and I understood then. I had become just like the others, another lost soul on Highway 65, caught in its dark, never-ending grip. The road had taken me, just as it had taken so many before, and there, in the distance, I could hear the tapping again. Faint, rhythmic, like the sound of the world waiting for the next to fall. I couldn't leave. No one could. The road was their home now, and it would always be mine. I've been a long-haul trucker for over years, driving through every kind of weather and terrain you can imagine. But no matter where I go, one stretch of road always gives me chills. Highway in the middle of nowhere, Arizona. It's a lonely strip of road with no lights, no signs of life, and a silence so deep it feels like the world has forgotten you. I never used to believe in ghosts or spirits. To me, those were just tales people told to scare kids or pass time around a campfire. But after what I experienced last year, I'm not so sure anymore. It all started on a late October night. I had a tight deadline to deliver a load of construction equipment to a small town in New Mexico. My dispatcher warned me about taking highway after dark, but it was the quickest route, and I was behind schedule. I told myself it was just another highway, nothing to worry about. I hit the road around PM, the air crisp and cold. The moon was high, casting a pale light over the desert. At first, everything was fine. The hum of my engine and the occasional crackle of the CB radio kept me company. But as I drove deeper into the desert, the road seemed to stretch endlessly, and the world outside grew eerily quiet. About an hour in, my radio started acting up. Static filled the speakers, and I couldn't pick up any channels. I tried adjusting the dial, but nothing worked. Frustrated, I turned it off and focused on the road ahead. That's when I noticed the first sign of trouble. A figure was standing by the side of the road, barely visible in my headlights. It was a woman, wearing an old-fashioned white dress that looked out of place. She didn't wave or ask for help. She just stood there, staring at me as I passed. Her eyes caught the light, glowing faintly in the darkness. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe she was part of some roadside attraction or a traveler who got stranded. But something about her felt wrong. Her stillness, her pale face, it made my skin crawl. About miles later, I saw her again. Same white dress, same eerie stare. This time, she was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching against the asphalt. My heart raced as I stopped just a few feet away from her. I rolled down the window and yelled, "Do you need help?" But she didn't respond. She just tilted her head, as if studying me. Her lips moved, but I couldn't hear what she was saying. Something told me to leave. My instincts screamed that this wasn't normal. I hit the gas and swerved around her, my trailer rattling as I sped away. My rearview mirror showed her standing there, watching me until she faded into the distance. I thought that was the end of it, but I was wrong. A few minutes later, my headlights caught something in the distance. Another truck was coming toward me, its headlights blazing. I flashed my high beams to signal it, but the truck didn't slow down. As it got closer, I realized there was something off about it. The truck was old, its paint peeling and rusted. Its headlights flickered like dying candles. Worse, there was no driver behind the wheel. It sped past me, and as it did, I felt a sudden chill in the air. My breath fogged up the windshield, even though the heater was on. I checked my mirrors, but the phantom truck was gone, vanished into thin air. My hands were shaking as I gripped the wheel. I turned the CB radio back on, hoping to distract myself, but instead of static, I heard a voice. It was faint and garbled, like it was coming from a far-off place. "Turn. Back. Not safe." The voice repeated the warning over and over. I tried to respond, but the radio went dead again. By now I was too scared to think straight. I wanted to get off that highway as fast as possible. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, my truck started to sputter. The engine coughed and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of the road. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out to check the engine, the desert air biting at my skin. As I opened the hood, I heard footsteps behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. Then I saw her, the woman in white, standing a few feet away. This time her face was twisted into a grotesque smile, her eyes glowing brighter than before. "Leave," she whispered, her voice echoing in my head. "This is my road." I stumbled back, tripping over my own feet. My flashlight flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. I scrambled to my feet and ran back to the truck, slamming the door shut. The engine roared to life on its own, and I didn't question it. I floored the gas pedal and didn't stop until I reached the next town. When I told the locals what happened, they exchanged uneasy glances. One old-timer leaned in and said, "You met her, didn't you? The lady of Highway 66. She's been haunting that stretch for decades. No one knows who she was, but drivers who see her rarely make it out alive. I've avoided Highway ever since. Even now, when I drive through the desert, I keep an eye on the mirrors, half expecting to see her standing there, watching me. So if you're ever out on the open road and see a woman in white, do yourself a favor, don't stop. Some roads are meant to stay empty." After that night, the nightmares began. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her, the woman in white, staring at me with those glowing eyes. Sometimes she was standing at the end of my bed. Other times, she was in my passenger seat, smiling that horrible smile. I started sleeping in truck stops with the cab lights on, but it didn't help. Her image was burned into my mind. I tried to convince myself it was just stress, maybe exhaustion from too many late-night hauls. But deep down, I knew better. Something had followed me off that highway, something that wasn't ready to let go. A few weeks later, I was on another haul through Nevada, far from highway. The desert stretched on for miles, the landscape barren and lonely. As I drove, I thought I saw movement in my side mirror. At first, I chalked it up to shadows playing tricks on me. But when I looked again, I saw her face, pale and unblinking, staring at me from the back of my trailer. I slammed on the brakes, my heart pounding. When I got out to check, there was nothing there. The trailer was empty, just as it should have been. But as I climbed back into the cab, I noticed something chilling. On the dusty back window, a single word was written, "Mine." I couldn't ignore it anymore. Something was happening, and I needed to understand what. On my next day off, I drove back to Arizona and visited a small-town library near Highway. The librarian, a woman in her 60s, seemed surprised when I mentioned the ghost. "Ah, the lady in white," she said, her voice low. "You're not the first trucker to see her, you know. They say she was a bride who died in a crash on her wedding night. Others claim she was a drifter who disappeared on that highway decades ago. Whatever the truth is, she doesn't take kindly to strangers." She handed me a faded newspaper clipping from the S. It showed a photo of a young woman smiling and happy. The headline read, "Bride to be killed in tragic accident." According to the article, she and her fiancé were driving to their honeymoon when their car broke down on highway. While they waited for help, a drunk driver veered off the road and hit them. The fiancé survived, but the bride died instantly. Witnesses claimed her spirit never left the highway. "I should have left it alone. Every instinct told me to stay far away from Highway 66, but something compelled me to go back. Maybe it was guilt for not stopping that night, or maybe I just needed closure. Whatever the reason, I found myself back on that cursed stretch of road late one evening, hoping to confront the lady in white. The highway was just as I remembered it, long, empty, and unnervingly quiet. I drove slowly, scanning the darkness for any sign of her. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I started to think maybe it was all in my head. Then, around midnight, my headlights caught a figure standing in the middle of the road. It was her. This time I didn't stop. I rolled down the window and yelled, "What do you want from me?" She didn't move. Her glowing eyes locked onto mine, and her lips curled into that same unsettling smile. Suddenly, my truck's engine sputtered and died, leaving me stranded in the middle of the highway. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out, my hands trembling. The air around me felt heavy, like something unseen was pressing down on my chest. As I approached her, she whispered, "You shouldn't have come back." Her voice was soft but chilling, like a cold wind cutting through the night. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice shaking. "I didn't mean to disturb you." Her expression softened for a moment, almost as if she understood. But then, the ground beneath me started to tremble, and the air filled with the sound of distant screams. Shadows began to gather around her, taking on the shapes of figures, other drivers perhaps, who had met their end on this road. "You're just like them," she said, her voice echoing. "You don't belong here." I turned and ran back to my truck, the flashlight flickering wildly in my hand. The shadows followed me, their whispers growing louder. When I reached the cab, the engine roared to life on its own, the headlights cutting through the darkness. Without hesitation, I floored the gas pedal and sped down the highway. In the rearview mirror, I saw her standing in the road, the shadows swirling around her. Her figure grew smaller and smaller until it finally disappeared. The whispers faded, and the air grew still once more. I haven't gone near highway since that night, and I've made peace with the fact that I'll never fully understand what happened. Some roads are cursed, and some spirits are trapped in their pain, unable to move on. I don't know why she chose to let me go, but I'm grateful. Every now and then, I hear stories from other truckers, rumors of a ghostly bride haunting a lonely desert road. I never share my story, but when they ask if I believe in ghosts, I just nod. Because now, I do. After that night, I decided to give up long-haul trucking. The open road, once my sanctuary, had turned into a place of fear. I sold my rig and took a job closer to home, where the roads were well lit and the nights weren't so lonely. But no matter how far I've tried to run, a part of me feels like I left something behind on Highway 66, or maybe something from there stayed with me. I still dream about her sometimes. In my sleep, I see her standing by the roadside, her glowing eyes cutting through the darkness. She doesn't smile anymore, she just watches, waiting. For you drivers out there who love the open road, heed this warning. If you ever find yourself on Highway 66 at night and see a woman in white, don't stop. Don't ask questions, just keep driving. Some roads aren't meant to be traveled, and some spirits aren't meant to rest.